afternoon, DC Attorney General Racine, the National Association of Attorney Generals, and all those gathered here today. Thank you for providing me with the opportunity to provide insight on how litigation and restorative justice can be used as tools to protect and defend survivors of hate crimes and their families after experiencing hate and extremism in person and online. Unfortunately, I know firsthand that in-person and online hate ruins lives by stoking fear, silencing voices, and causing harm to people's physical and professional safety, all of which have serious and lasting effects on victims and their families. 4 years, 4 months, and 29 days ago, I found myself at the center of a racially motivated hate crime in the nation's capital, on the campus of American University during my junior year of college. I was a subsequent target of threatening cyber harassment campaign at the fingertips of white supremacists. On April 30th, 2017, I was sworn in as the first Black woman to be student government president after returning from a sorority conference and receiving a competitive leadership award. The following day, May 1st, my first day in office, a mass perpetrator hung bananas from black corded nooses around campus from light posts and bus stops. The bananas were labeled with AKA and AKA free, referencing Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, the predominantly Black sorority of which I am a member. Some other bananas also referenced Harambe Bait, referencing the gorilla that was killed at Cincinnati Zoo in 2016. I was first notified about the hate crime, however, by a fellow student who had seen images of the bananas hanging from nooses on social media. I then called a university administrator to inform her of what I had learned. It was at this point that I was notified that university police were already investigating this incident as a hate crime before anyone had informed, contacted, or reached out to myself or anyone else in our sorority chapter to let us know that our safety was at risk. One of the young women in my chapter who was there then is also here with us now. Oh. This bigoted hate crime struck me to my core, as if the perpetrator was implying that I ought to be lynched or put down for making history. It also served as a painful reminder of both this country's legacy of lynching and racism, and that in my grandmother's lifetime, Emmett Till was killed, and in today's time, her granddaughter has faced similar threats. 2 days after the hate crime, I was notified that university police were working to investigate this crime, along with Metropolitan Police Department, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Department of Justice. The very next day, May 4th, 2017, images of my face were photoshopped to put a KFC bucket on my head, while nigger agitator, nigress, and she-boon were just a few of the hundreds of racist and sexist comments and derogatory innuendos that were posted across various social media platforms, chat rooms, and the dark net. On May 4th, I received an email from the Anti-Defamation League notifying me that a known neo-Nazi had incited a racially motivated cyber harassment campaign against me on social media. Andrew Anglin, founder of the anti-Semitic website, The Daily Stormer, named after a Nazi newspaper, Der Stormer, encouraged his followers to, quote, send me some words of support by doxing me and providing his followers with a direct link to my Facebook page and my Twitter page. In other words, Anglin and many of his followers and his army posted my information online with the intent to use that information to harass, stalk, and threaten me, and to be used against me for an unlawful purpose. Upon receiving the ADL's email, I did what any student educated in the post-Columbine era would do, which is to go into active shooter drill mode. So I closed all the blinds, I locked all the doors, I turned off all the lights, I sat low to the ground and out of sight of any window, while staying as silent as I could and placing a frantic call to my parents, and then to the Metropolitan Police Department. What started as a week celebrating a historic and personal achievement had turned into a never-ending nightmare. The week the hate crime occurred and the cyber harassment began also coincided with our final exam period. During that time, I was expected to complete 4 final examinations, with a 5th to complete the following week. Over the 96-hour period between May 1st and the minute I received the ADL's email, I had only 14 hours of sleep and had only 1 full meal on my stomach. In the end, I was unable to complete my final examinations on time, and had to finish my coursework over the summer. In the days, weeks, and months that followed, I continued my studies at American University, each day walking past the very spots where the bananas and nooses were hung. I also had to change my privacy settings on all forms of social media, limit my interaction on the internet, increase my personal security measures, including but not limited to carrying pepper spray, putting up cameras around my home, and receiving protection from university police and local law enforcement. Eventually, I was diagnosed with PTSD, depression, and anxiety because of these hateful incidences, which caused me to suffer from flashbacks, from lack of sleep due to intrusive thoughts and nightmares, lack of appetite and stress that caused me to lose 20 pounds, 15% of my body weight, and intense feelings of being unsafe that resulted through panic attacks. There were days when I was unable to carry on a conversation without having an anxiety attack or even get out of bed and eat a meal. And there were definitely days when all I could do was stare at the ceiling. Since England's troll storm, some of the threatening, racist, and sexist comments directed towards me on the internet on social media platforms like YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter in the past 4 years include but are not limited to, quote, "I wonder what color the blood looks like." Quote, "I wish I knew her address. I would send her a noose so she can go hang herself and do the world a favor." Quote, "I take my chances with hiding her small tit body after her fatal accident." Quote, "I'll take a few years for painting the street with her blood." Quote, "Just smash her in the head with a bike lock hard enough to split her head open with a wound that needed stitches. I seen you only get probation for that offense." And while I was doxxed by neo-Nazis 4 years ago, the harassment incited on me on various social media platforms continued. I continue to receive threatening messages to this day. But just because these incidences happen digitally does not mean they should be taken less seriously. Hate should never be normalized. I am now used to reviewing, filtering, identifying, screenshotting, and saving multiple harassing and threatening comments on a monthly basis in the event that the comments rise to the level of a true threat, specifying time, place, and manner of attack in order to determine what is an actionable threat for law enforcement. But I shouldn't have to be. Displacing this burden and putting it on those who have been impacted is just one of the reasons why hate crime targets and incidences are underreported each year. Victims and survivors should not be the ones forced to jump through hurdles of navigating law enforcement bureaucracy and face re-traumatization just to report hate crimes and hate incidences. Nor should they be the ones on the front lines having to protect themselves from these kinds of harassment. This is why on April 30th, 2018, just one day short of the May 1 hate crime, I sued Andrew England, the Daily Stormer parent company, and 2 other defendants in federal court for violating the DC Human Rights Act, which prohibits individuals from interfering with someone's use of public accommodations, with pro bono representation from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, the Washington Lawyers Committee, and Kirkland & Ellis LLP. With my lawyers' help, we were able to develop a novel approach to combat online racial and gender-based harassment and threats using public accommodations law as a vehicle for justice, as well as to create restorative justice-based settlement with one of the defendants. By mid-December 2018, I was well into my first year of law school when we entered into a groundbreaking settlement with one of the defendants in the case, centered around principles of restorative justice and the desire to heal both the victim and the perpetrator. This settlement required the individual to issue a sincere in-person apology, which was recorded for educational purposes, required him to undergo anti-hate training and counseling, to commit 200 hours of community service with racial justice organizations, as well as to renounce and publicly advocate against hate, bigotry, and white supremacy. And while we were able to reach a settlement with one of the defendants, we continued to pursue litigation against the remaining defendants in the case. Our efforts were met with success on August 9, 2019, when Judge Rosemary M. Collier for the United States District of Columbia set precedent in Dumpson versus AID by ruling that racist online harassment can interfere with an individual's equal access to public accommodations, as I had to make significant changes to how I navigated my life on a day-to-day basis, including how I navigated campus. Further, Judge Rosemary Collier found that a causal nexus exists between the troll storm created by Andrew Anglin and my enjoyment of American University, and that I was indeed targeted because of my race and my gender. Later that month, I met the defendant that we settled with face to face, one of the many individuals who threatened me online and made racist comments, and I received the in-person apology that he gave. To this day, it is impossible for me to put into words how the moment spent in the room for the apology truly made me feel, or to hypothesize about the sincerity of his apology. It's one aspect of my story that I'm continuing to work through. However, when I think back to that day, I draw the most strength from knowing that rather than using that moment to center his words and to accept his apology as most people expected or assumed, I used that time as an opportunity to tell my own story, to explain to him the real harm he had caused, and most importantly, to hold him accountable. I speak from experience when I say that when perpetrators of racially and gender-motivated attacks are not held accountable for their actions, instances of hate, bigotry, and prejudice run rampant. Bias-motivated attacks, both in person and online, are no laughing matter, but you don't have to listen to me to understand that. Just look at the most recent hate crimes data released by the Justice Department. In 2020, hate crimes rose for the 6th of the past 7 years, for the highest level in over a decade. Of note, we also saw a rise in anti-Black and anti-Asian hate crimes, likely linked to renewed calls for racial justice in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the anti-Asian rhetoric used by elected officials and political candidates during the pandemic and the 2020 election cycle. But to be clear, hate crimes are not a partisan issue. They're an American issue and a threat to our democracy. Today, domestic and international extremists are using the internet for the purposes of recruiting, organizing, and mobilizing members of their community to commit threatening acts online and in person. This can be seen through the use of the internet by white nationalists to plan, execute, and broadcast acts of violence like the Emmanuel AME church shooting, the Unite the Right rally, the Tree of Life synagogue shooting, the Orlando Pulse nightclub attack, and the El Paso shooting, just to name a few. As a society, we cannot afford to allow these behaviors to go unchecked, or else we risk normalizing this form of extremism. As a legal profession, we cannot wait for the laws of yesterday to catch up to the technology of today before we attempt to defend the civil rights of all people with the tools that are presently available to us. And as human beings, we cannot look away from the current injustices we see while waiting for other people to first intervene. Together, we can and must use the tools at our disposal to come up with creative remedies to address the detrimental impact hate crimes and incidents have on the most vulnerable members of our community. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Taylor, for that recitation of what you experienced. In particular, I think everybody in the room sees and feels your resilience and your strength, and I know from our conversations that you're a believer in the ability of all of us to get through these kinds of circumstances and to make our country a great country that it can be. So thank you very much for joining us. Let me now invite David Yost and General Yost's panel up to the stage.